As he walks back towards George Street, O'Connor thinks of Catherine, his wife who died, her shape and her smell and the sound of her voice whispering in his ear as they danced one Christmas Eve in the Finnegans' parlour, with Patrick Mooney playing the fiddle and the others laughing and clapping along. It's painful to remember her still so alive, the press of her hand on his shoulder and the pale part of her coal black hair. But the thought that one day that pain might fade or disappear completely is worse. Forgetting is the final betrayal, he thinks. The pain is what is left of the love, and when that pain is gone, there is nothing. After she died, he started drinking whiskey every day. It felt like a means of survival, a way of fending off the future. He would drink in the mornings before he left for work, and in the afternoons, if he was alone, he would find a quiet pub and drink some more. He should have been dismissed half a dozen times. It was only Pat Hurley, the inspector, who shielded him, made excuses, but in the end, even Hurley lost patience. He called him in one day and told him that it was Manchester or nothing. He said he would write the reference for Maybury without making any mention of the drinking, but that was the very last lie he would tell.
Welcome to the Good Reading Magazine podcast, sponsored by Pantera Press. Good Reading is a monthly magazine dedicated to books and reading and aims to help readers discover their next favourite book. You can find out more about the books discussed on today's podcast at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.
Hello and welcome back to the Good Reading Podcast. I am Max Lewis, and today we're joined by Ian McGuire, talking about his new historical fiction novel, The Abstainer. In Manchester, 1867, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, also known as the Fenians, are out for blood after 3 of their men are hung for the murder of a police officer. Head Constable James O'Connor arrives from Dublin for a sober start, hoping to discover and thwart the Fenians' plans. Meanwhile, Irish-American Civil War veteran Stephen Doyle arrives and joins the Fenians, seeking a personal vengeance. 2 men haunted by their pasts and driven for the need for justice are drawn together in a novel that is bloody, gritty, and absolutely captivating. Ian, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me.
So your novel begins with the historical event that inspired it, that being the hanging of 3 members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood in 1876 for the murder of a Manchester police sergeant. How did you come across that event, and what about it inspired you to write The Abstainer?
Well, it's an event in Manchester history, and I've lived in Manchester for about 25 years. So I kind of stumbled across it when I was actually doing research for my last novel. And I was a bit shocked and slightly embarrassed that I hadn't known about this before, because it was such a big incident in the 1860s. It's been more or less forgotten about, really, outside the Irish community of Manchester anyway. So that was the first thing that sort of grabbed my attention, that this is a piece of history which seemed very dramatic and important, which had sort of dropped out of popular awareness. And the other thing which really drew me to it was, it seemed to me an incident which connected to things which were still very much alive today. So it's a story about nationalism, people's willingness to die for nations, and nationalism seems to be an issue which is really recurring, especially in Europe at the moment. And it's a story about terrorism as well. And of course, terrorism never, unfortunately, seems to go away. So it was those two things. It was the fact that it was this forgotten moment of Irish, English, Manchester history, and also it was one that connected so strongly to things which are still continuing and are with us now.
And as you mentioned, to both Irish and English people, this era of history and the continued bloodshed that happened with periods like the Troubles, it's quite a sensitive topic that many still carry scars over. As an Englishman yourself, how did you go about crafting the story of the Abstainer while maintaining respect for both sides, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting issue. It's something which I both thought about and didn't think about, I suppose. And in a sense, I felt like I couldn't write this novel worrying too much about what people might think about it, really. I mean, I think that's always the case. You might have a kind of reader in mind, but you don't want to worry too much about particular reactions which you can't sort of control and worry about. So I suppose that was my first instinct, was just to sort of tell the story in an interesting and a kind of truthful way, and then just let people respond to it how they will. I mean, I suppose deeper down than that, of course, the story is about two men, or at least O'Connor, the central protagonist of the story, is a man who's sort of caught between two worlds, caught between the British and the Irish. So in some sense, his perspective allowed me to sort of negotiate between both sides without necessarily throwing my weight behind either one, which I think was quite useful for me as a writer. I didn't want to sort of feel like I was committed to supporting either side in the conflict.
Readers who loved your last book, The Northwater, for its attention to immersive historic detail, they'll be pleased to hear that The Abstainer continues that tradition, depicting a very dark vision of Manchester in 1867, as well as Pennsylvania a bit later on. What research did you do to capture that gritty, immersive detail of those places?
Well, I live in Manchester, so it was in some sense, it was relatively straightforward.
Yeah.
But it was interesting. I mean, I did a lot of walking around in the early stages before I even started writing, just to sort of familiarize myself with the areas where the people in the novel lived and where they moved around. And although there is a fair amount of Victorian Manchester still existing, I was sort of surprised at how little was left, actually. That was one of the interesting things about, I suppose, 75-80% of the city that was there in 1867 is now gone. And what's particularly gone, which is sort of particularly painful for the novelist, are the kind of ordinary places, the kind of ordinary houses where working class people would live, which is where most of the novel takes place. Being in Manchester was helpful, but it wasn't that helpful, because most of what I really was interested in had disappeared. So I went back to, in one sense, I went back to maps. So there's some fantastic, incredibly detailed maps of Manchester in the 1840s or 1850s. So I used that a lot just to get a sense of the geography. I mean, these maps are so detailed. They give names of pubs, and they tell you what each building is and where lampposts were and strange things like that. So I relied on that. And then also there are a few really quite evocative photographs that were taken in Manchester in around the 1850s by a man named Mudd, M-U-D-D, who was kind of one of the early pioneers of sort of photography. And he took these very strange sort of atmospheric pictures of Manchester without any people in them. Those were things I really went back on in terms of just imagining what the city might have been like, and trying to sort of conjure it up in my mind, really.
Talking about your last book, The Northwater, there's a few parallels between that and The Abstainer that I thought were a bit interesting. Both of them focus on two men, one who is trying to start anew after hitting rock bottom, so to speak, and the other who is on sort of a murderous personal quest, for lack of a better term. What draws you to this theme and those kinds of characters when you're writing your historical fiction?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of structure of two men, two antagonists, is I suppose, quite a sort of classic dramatic structure to have. Two men sort of facing off, and the narrative becomes the struggle between them. So I think it's the dramatic sort of force of that which allures me in. And I think, yeah, they are. I mean, structurally, the novels are similar in that way, but I think in some sense that the characters are different as well. Although O'Connor and Doyle sort of spend the novel struggling with each other in a certain similar way to the two main characters in Northwater. I think, their motivations and what pushes them is slightly different. But yeah, that central conflict. I mean, novels are all about conflict, is what I tell my students when I try to teach them how to write. So having two men facing off is a kind of very simple way of generating a kind of powerful narrative drive which will push the story forward.
And that conflict in the Northwater especially drew from literary classics like Heart of Darkness and Moby Dick. Were there any novels of that ilk that you drew upon thematically for The Abstainer?
Yeah, lots in some ways. I suppose the most obvious one, which I read, again, kind of early on in the process of thinking about this novel, was Joseph Conrad's novel, The Secret Agent. It's about a group of anarchists in London at the turn of the century who are plotting to blow up the Greenwich Observatory. As the secret agent of the title is kind of an informer who's within their group. So it was a novel I went to because I thought, well, I'm writing about kind of Victorian terrorism. What's a kind of good model? And that was the one that sprung to mind. And it was, yeah, it's a really useful way to begin. I think the thing that really stuck with me from that novel is the way he imagines the group and the kind of dynamics between these different sort of strange, eccentric radicals and revolutionaries. So that was really useful in terms of trying to think about the psychology of a group like the Fenians, who were a secret society, who are bound together by this sacred oath, yet a kind of inevitably a sort of slightly ragtag group of different people. So Conrad was really helpful in a way of thinking about that.
And in terms of more contemporary authors, your writing style is quite reminiscent of Cormac McCarthy, although you do tend to use quote marks as opposed to him. The Abstainer still captures that sense of very gritty detail, a sort of nihilistic look at humanity, and the detached sort of minimalist writing. Why do you like to write your historical fiction in that sort of way?
I mean, you're absolutely right that, particularly in North Water, I mean, Cormac McCarthy was a huge influence on that novel. And I actually, before I wrote The North Water, I sort of went back and reread a lot of McCarthy's work. You know, I was looking at the style and thinking about the style of McCarthy. And I mean, he's best known for his high sort of rhetoric, really, and for this kind of extraordinary sort of biblical sentences. But it struck me that McCarthy combines a very plain sort of pared down style of prose with that very rich, ornate, kind of often, as I said, sort of biblical rhetoric. And so that struck me as just a really interesting combination, a way of sort of striking two notes and allowing yourself to sort of move from one to the other. So that's something I think I've tried to sort of use and borrow. So I think in both the novels, and maybe even more in the Abstainer than in the North Water, there's a kind of movement, I think, in the style from a kind of plainness and a kind of simplicity to occasionally a kind of slightly richer, more ornate, more metaphorical kind of style. And it's just the movement, the kind of variety that gives you, which I find kind of appealing. I mean, the plainness allows you to just move the plot forward at speed when you need to, but then if you want to pause and if you want to sort of dig a little deeper and allow the reader to kind of slow down, then you can do that as well.
In the same way, the Abstainer doesn't shy away from that gritty historical detail. It also doesn't shy away from the violence of that era. And what interested me about the Abstainer particularly is that you rarely describe the violence as it happened, but we often see the aftermath of when the violence happens off screen, so to speak. What do you try to achieve with your depictions of violence in your writing?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that most of the violence in the Abstainer happens off screen, as it were. That became plain to me, actually, kind of almost when I finished it. I sort of looked back and thought, oh, actually, there's lots of violence in it, but very few descriptions of violence. I mean, I suppose I think of violence a little bit like sort of sex in some senses. There's no reason to go into great detail unless that incident is really important in the story. And I suppose in the North Water, it seemed to me there were more moments where describing the violence was important in terms of showing something about the characters and so on. I mean, the Abstainer, I think it was partly it didn't seem necessary to show the actual acts, and the kind of the force of that violence was perhaps more subtly rendered by showing its after effects than showing what actually happened. So that was one reason why I didn't feel the need to sort of dwell on it in this novel. The other reason, without giving too much away, I mean, a number of the acts of violence which are not described would involve a kind of torture, I think. And that's something I just didn't really want to write about. I suppose I just felt I wouldn't really want to sort of spend a lot of time thinking about that form of violence. It's a kind of line which I felt I didn't want to cross. So there's kind of slight squeamishness on my part, you could say, about certain kinds of cruelty, which the novel implies but doesn't actually describe.
Do you tend to be squeamish when you read violence on the page, or is there sort of a detachment when you're writing it yourself?
There is a detachment, I think, yes, and I'm not normally a squeamish person. I can whip through the sort of Cormac McCarthy horrors without blinking. I think it's just something about the idea of torture for me, which is particularly horrifying. I mean, there's a novel by J.M. Coetzee, Waiting for the Barbarians, which I think is a brilliant novel, which in part is about torture. And he doesn't actually show that. He shows the after effects of it, and he thinks about it. But yeah, for me, that kind of deliberate sort of cruelty is something it would be hard for me to sort of sit down and want to describe in blow by blow detail.
Especially since, given the nature of a historical fiction novel, you're talking about a time where that kind of torture almost certainly did happen. So I can understand why it might be a little bit kind of glorifying it almost if you sort of dwelled upon it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the way that groups like that deal with traitors and deal with informers is always involves a kind of cruelty, because there's a desire not only to eliminate them but to sort of make an example of them in certain ways. Yeah, I mean, I read a certain amount about more recent kind of IRA activity and things in which that kind of thing happened, and it is really, really pretty gruesome.
Dialing in on the characters a little more, we talked a little bit about James O'Connor, and you mentioned how he's sort of a middle ground between the Fenians and Manchester. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the aspects of his character, such as his abstaining from alcohol. What was sort of the thinking behind some other aspects of his character?
I guess there are a couple of really important things about O'Connor which have happened to him before the novel opens. I mean, one thing is the death of his wife, which is the direct cause of his drinking. But before that, we learn quite a lot about his childhood and the sort of traumas of his childhood, and particularly his relationship with his father. So I think those factors are always behind everything that O'Connor does. I think from O'Connor's perspective, the novel is very much about loss and how to cope with loss. And the drinking is a kind of immediate attempt to escape from the experience of grief and to escape from the process of grieving in some way and the difficulty of that process. And as the novel goes forward, I think he tries to find other ways of coping with the loss and of recovering from his past, both his immediate past with his wife and his deeper past with his father. And everything he does, in some sense, could be seen as a struggle to redeem himself, to recover from that, to escape from the various kind of burdens of the past. And the novel, in some sense, asks, one of the big questions I think the novel asks is to what extent is it possible for us to escape from our past and to put what's happened behind us? And O'Connor sort of plays out that question, really.
And that leads me to my next question, which was exploring Stephen Doyle a little bit more, because he comes with his own baggage that he's trying to escape from. What was the thinking behind his character?
Yeah, so Doyle is a Civil War veteran who is sent to Manchester to revenge the hangings of his sort of Fenian comrades. He's based on actual characters, in the sense that the Irish Civil War veterans were an important part of the Fenian sort of military terrorist activities in the 1860s. But yeah, he has his own backstory. He has his own experience of sort of loss and trauma. I suppose the difference between O'Connor, one of the differences between O'Connor and Doyle, is that Doyle's means of recovering from his particular past and of finding a meaning in his life is through warfare and through his attachment to a larger cause, in this case the Fenians. He gains a kind of meaning through fighting, through violence, and through his attachment to the Irish cause, whereas O'Connor doesn't have that kind of larger attachment. His attempts to recover from the past are to do with more personal relationships, more individual, kind of affectionate relationships, you could say, whereas Doyle attaches himself to these larger forces and becomes a kind of a smaller element in these larger movements, and that's the way in which he copes and recovers from what's happened to him in the past.
For my last question, I wanted to ask about your writing of historical fiction in general. So The Abstainer is your second historical fiction novel, but it's not the only genre you've dabbled in. Your debut, Incredible Bodies, was a satirical novel set in the present day in a college.
Yes.
And you've also written a non-fiction book about Richard Ford.
Yes.
Given the success of The Northwater and probably the success of The Abstainer, I'm curious if historical fiction will sort of be your mainstay or if you'll touch on other fiction genres during your career.
Yeah, it's a question I've been slightly turning over in my own mind, actually. I mean, I'm working on another novel which is historical, but then that will be sort of 3 historical novels. So I do feel like after that I might want to do something a little bit different. Yeah, I don't want to plow exactly the same furrow indefinitely. So yeah, I think I will branch out, whether that means a novel set in the present or certainly at least in a different historical period, not in the 19th century. That appeals to me. I think it's important as a writer to sort of stretch yourself and not to get into a kind of rut. But at the same time, it's always, where do these stories come from? And they don't come that frequently in some ways. So a really good idea for a novel doesn't pop up every day. So I think in some sense I'm at the mercy of whether I can find a really good idea which is set in the present or set in a different historical period. And I have to just wait and see and cross my fingers and hope that something comes up which allows me to branch off in a slightly different direction.
Well, you mentioned a third novel that you're working on. You're able to share some details on what it might be about, or I guess what period it might be focusing on?
It's a slightly earlier period. It's late 18th century, and it's set amidst the kind of fur trade of northern Canada. That's all I can say at the moment.
Okay, that sounds very interesting. Well, Ian, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're very welcome, Max. Good to talk to you.